Okay, shall we get started? All right, warm welcome to everybody to Hudson, and of course to those of us who are joining us online. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that we don't talk enough about, Canada, but Hudson wants to be part of the conversation with Canada. There are institutions that deal with, obviously, bilateral relationship in Washington that already do so. But we have a very important guest here, Dr. Christian Leuprecht, a distinguished professor at the Royal Canadian Military College, as well as at Queen's University, who has been writing a lot on the bilateral relationship and who can offer some particular insights. My name is Matt Boyse. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'm happy to have you here, Christian. This whole conversation got started with sort of as Canadians watch what's going on in our country. Some of them are making observations about, well, is Canada ready for what is happening in our country, and what might then the outcome of the election, and watching underlying trends as well, because you have some extremely incisive observers of the American scene. Sometimes your Canadians know more about what's going on in our country than we do. You watch it so carefully, as I discovered when I was living in Ottawa for 3 years, a few years ago. So Christian, one of your theses was that as domestic there's undercurrents, and as the domestic situation changes in the United States, that also has implications for foreign policy and security policy, and that you were observing that a number of Canadian pundits were wondering whether Canada was sufficiently kind of poised to maximize the relationship based on what's happening here. And I haven't probably put that as elegantly as some of your pundits have, but the point is Canada poised to make the most out of this relationship, given the importance of North America, the security and prosperity of the North American continent, which is something we also need to think about. And so maybe just ask you to kind of provide your thoughts on that subject for 5 or 10 minutes or whatever, and then I've got a whole bunch of other questions on Canadian issues in particular that I think that Americans who care about security and foreign policy are thinking about, and we can then go to that, and then of course to the questions and from our visitors today. So again, welcome to Hudson, and we're really interested in what you have to say, because this is a relationship we don't always think about as much as we should, quite frankly, despite the fact that we're such close allies, neighbors, and friends, and partners, and there are so many unbelievable close connections. So, welcome again.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être venu. Say a couple of words.
Starting off, and
so recognize the diverse nature of Canada, and always nice to sit beside the Canadian flag, because what even many Canadians don't realize is that the Canadian flag is actually based on the RMC flag. And so if you go to RMC and you come to Kingston, and you can see the plaque of the Flag Committee in 1965 and its debates about the flag. So the birthplace of the flag, and the birthplace in that sense also sort of a more systematic effort to build a nationalist sentiment. And as we can see, people have different visions for their country. And one of the things that we might, as outsiders, have preferences for one vision or another in the political spectrum in the United States. But one of the things that I always admire is that Americans have a vision for their country. They might be deeply divided about that vision, but I always wish that countries such as Canada and other allies would have a stronger sense of vision and mission, and that might also then give them more of an incentive to invest in key public institutions, including security and defense. You can always, of course, observe the village sort of from inside the village or from outside of the village. In Canada's case, it has the added challenge that, of course, the relationship is existential for Canada. And Canada, also being a federation, thinks, I think, of the United States not simply as one country, but as 50 jurisdictions. And you add to that the 10 Canadian provinces, you have 60 jurisdictions. We have some of the representatives from the provinces here with us today. And so, of course, the sub-state dimensions. And I bring that up because a lot of the relationships that I think countries have tend to be transactional. And one of the key differences between Canada and the United States is that the level of integration has not just created an interdependence, but I think a level of codependence that to some extent insulates the relationship a bit from the politics of the day. And so you always have this two-level game, I think, going on the one hand at the political level, and on the other hand at the institutional level. So you have a bilateral relationship, and you also have a binational relationship. And I think that partially explains sort of the enduring nature of that relationship. And of course, the other interesting dimension perhaps to consider is we're coming up on 100 years of official diplomatic relations between the two countries. One of the interesting quirks about the relationship is that Canada, among the old established countries, was one of among the latter countries with which the United States established relations, because of course before that relations were with the United Kingdom. So you can think about it as coming up of 100 years of making this relationship, making the relationship work. And that's an important, I think, point to start, because my sense is that in Ottawa, we've forgotten about how we got here and how we built that relationship. And without doing too much history here, we didn't get to this continent and to this relationship by accident. We got to it by deliberate and intentional design by both parties to this relationship. And that was with the disruptive effects, of course, of World War II. And I always like to remind Americans that even though we might have some criticism about how Canada sees, in particular, its contribution to defense, security, and stability in the 21st century, in World War II, it was, of course, Canada that was part of the fight from day one. It was Canada that held down the fort on that island off the European coast, from which the United States and allies would eventually launch the invasion. And just as a counterfactual, imagine how the world might look differently if Canada hadn't been there to hold down that fort and in many ways contribute to changing history. In 1938 and 1940, respectively, the US President, the Canadian Prime Minister, had the Ogdensburg Declaration, and what's become known as the Kingston Dispensation. So the essence of that Canada and the United States would defend the continent and the interests of the continent together. And that, of course, didn't come out of sort of pure sort of accident. It came out of a concern by the United States about Canada's ability and willingness to defend its territory and its continent, and a concrete proposal to post US troops in Newfoundland, which was then not part of Canada. It didn't become part of Canada until 1949, and in British Columbia. And so part of the counter proposal to that by Canada was that we work together to build a strategic relationship. And of course, that also meant then after World War II, working together to assert common interests in building the international institutions that would become the rules-based international order that arguably has made North America the most prosperous, the most politically stable, and in many ways, the most harmonious, perhaps, political arrangement and continent the world has ever known. And so no surprise that many people around the world would love to live on this continent. And so this is just to remind us that we got here by shaping the continent and by using the strengths of the bilateral relationship to shape the international relationships, and in particular the stability of the Euro-Atlantic community, not just as a security community, but as an economic and as a political community in an effort to shape the world. What Canada also took away from that experience is that anything that endangers that relationship, that Euro-Atlantic relationship, the transatlantic security community, so that anything in Europe that might imperil the territorial integrity of Europe and European countries, the prosperity, the social harmony, and the political stability of Europe ultimately poses a fundamental risk and threat to Canada's geostrategic interests, both because of the blood and treasure that Canada spilled in the first half of the 20th century, and because Canada uses the relationship with Europe and with European allies to counterbalance and offset some of the inclinations towards US unilateralism. In terms of the continental security community that Canada and the United States have built, there's also, of course, the sense that continental security isn't just a goal in and of itself. It's an opportunity to preserve sovereignty, because the moment the continent is threatened, it means that now your ability to make sovereign decisions about world affairs is potentially constrained by adversaries who might threaten the continent. And it also imperils, of course, the Americans' ability for extended deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence that is ultimately grounded in North America. And so Canada has a vital stake in continental security. But Canada, what makes the relationship so strong, also presents significant vulnerabilities. Those of you who have followed Canada and the foreign interference public inquiry known as the Hogue Commission that is currently ongoing. So inherently, when you're that closely intertwined politically, economically, socially with the United States is a pretty robust target to try to attack. So Canada is a weaker target, and you can have similarly multiplying effects by undermining Canadian democratic and political institution, Canadian prosperity, and Canadian social harmony. Canadians always, and Canadian politicians always like to say that Canada punches above its weight. Now, I'm no boxer, but those of you who know a little bit about boxing, as far as I know, there is no category for punching above your weight. So you actually need to pick what category you're going to punch in. And Canada is always purported to punch in the middle power category. Now, why would it do that? Because it allows Canada, so coming up with this concept of Canada as a middle power allows Canada to shape international interests, because middle powers, trading powers such as Canada, have key international interests, and one of them is inherently stability. Because anytime you have conflict and instability, that's inherently bad for trade. It's also important in terms of balancing, as I mentioned. In particular, so this is why I often say that NATO is ultimately Canada's most important multilateral institution. Because just like the way it allows the Americans in a very efficient and effective manner to coordinate 31 other allies, 30 of them in Europe, it also allows Canada to offset some of those propensities of US unilateralism through Europe. And so yes, Canada's most important strategic relationship is necessarily that with Washington, and thus the importance of continental security, Arctic security, and the like. But its second most important relationship is that transatlantic relationship with Europe. That also presents certain challenges as a middle power, because as a middle power, then Canada is always reticent to lead, because if you get out too far ahead of the game, and your allies, and especially Washington, doesn't follow, then you end up sort of with egg on your face. And so there's a sense of you want to hold back and you want to draft. The problem is, as I'll point out in a moment, and then I'll close on those comments in a moment, is that, of course, drafting behind the United States presents certain structural challenges, insofar as I think US and Canadian interests are diverging for these structural reasons. And so Canada will need to work a lot harder to get US attention. The other element for a middle power such as Canada is always you want to avoid getting caught in superpower conflicts. And so the challenges with the China relationship present a particular predicament for countries such as China, where you try not to get caught and sandwiched in between the two superpowers. My final comment on middle powers, traditional middle powers, not emerging middle powers, is that they have an inherent interest in the status quo, because their political power and their economic prosperity hinges on the status quo. And so if Canadian politicians would think strategically, they would understand that it is much cheaper to invest in preserving the status quo than possibly down the line having to try to defend it. And so the overall deterrence strategy and the proactive investment has served Canada, I would say, very well over the decades. Canada faces a particular risk in the current environment, which is, my sense is, for at least two reasons, likely more, that we can discuss. There are structural shifts in the United States. One is the structural shifts of simply public opinion in the United States when it comes to relationships with allies and partners. The other is, of course, in terms of superpower rivalry, the strategic pivot of the United States to the Indo-Pacific. And so I think the United States, also facing resource constraints, is looking to countries such as Canada to do more, in particular to do more in the European theater, where the United States says, we can support our European and our transatlantic allies, but we ultimately need them to do more for their security so that the United States can focus on the Indo-Pacific theater. And so this is where it behooves Canada to be able to do more of the heavy lifting in order to assert not just our European allies' strategic interest, but as I just explained, Canada's strategic interest in Europe. And so the great risk here for the United States is that, as I think so regardless, I think, of who ultimately gets elected on November 5th, that the relationship with allies will change. I always think of President Biden and his administration as the last of the transatlantic generation. And so whoever comes next is going to have less of an affinity with traditional allies and likely going to have a more transactional approach to the relationship. And so that means that allies, and in particular Canada, will need to invest more in the relationship in order to get the same or possibly even diminishing returns out of both the bilateral and the multilateral relationship. If Canada does not invest systematically and strategically in that relationship, understanding that it becomes more transactional, my sense is that, and you tell me if I'm wrong, people in Washington aren't much going to care because the United States will just do it on its own. But the United States doing it on its own presents great risks for Canada. A deceased colleague of mine at Queen's coined the phrase that in terms of the relationship with Canada, Canada has to defend from help. Canada never wants to find itself in a situation where the United States offer to help Canada with one of its foreign policy issues. And so this is the interesting debate about showing up on the radar in Washington, that on the one hand, you want to get bandwidth in Washington to get things done. At the same time, there's a liability to showing up in Washington on the radar because it usually means if you're showing up on the radar, somebody in Washington is concerned about what you're doing or might not be particularly pleased with what you're doing or with how you're doing it. The other key risk for Canada is that if the United States decide to decouple somewhat from the transatlantic relationship in particular, and European allies were to become more autarkic in terms of coordinating amongst themselves, that Canada would be left out in the cold. And so the greatest risk for Canadian foreign policy has always been for a country that is not systemically relevant to the geostrategic international order, being left out in the cold in terms of the ability to assert its interests. And so if Europe is not there in terms of that relationship to balance off the United States, Canada would necessarily be forced to draw even closer in terms of bilateral relationship, which would expose Canada to even more of the potential vagaries of transactionalism in terms of that bilateral relationship. So Canada has a keen interest in trying to preserve that multilateral Euro-Atlantic community and the institutions that are at the heart of solving collective action problems across that community. So maybe I'll just hold there and see sort of any reactions, criticisms, complaints about what I've said. As always,
cries of outrage.
So.
No, that's a lot to unpack, Christian. This question that you raised about transactionalism is one that's also I think we shouldn't necessarily take that all as a given. There's a lot more at stake than just transactional. I know that's become a buzzword, a bumper sticker, and a lot of people in Europe in particular, but I Canada as well, are using that phrase a lot. We can talk about that, but that's a lot longer conversation, and it's not. And we're here to talk about Canada, And you also represent, or you're a senior fellow at a very important think tank in Ottawa, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which we were very pleased to help launch your Washington operation, the Center for North American Prosperity and Security here. And so, your input is extremely valuable. But on this, let's just pretend that, well, let's just, for the sake of argument, use your word. I don't accept it entirely because I think there are other aspects to it that are not transactional. It has to do more with a desire, a very strong desire on the part of many American administrations for other countries to do more. And when they don't do more, then there's a grouchiness that sets in that sometimes is more than grouchiness. And then it is perceived on the other side as well, we have to do more because the Americans are upset, and that becomes a transaction as opposed to a common cause. But anyway, you've written, there are a lot of things I want to talk about. The northern border, because you've written something on that recently, and it's actually something we need to pay more attention to than we are. NATO, the China relationship, the India relationship, which has become surprisingly controversial recently, and then maybe the questions of your next election next year and who might be the next PM. But on the northern border, since you wrote something very recently, your title was very provocative. The U.S. should hold Canada accountable for its border security failings. Now, I happen to agree with that statement. So, I think you're very, because for the longest time we thought the northern border is basically the longest peaceful border, in the world, and it's wonderful. This has been true for decades and decades, or you could even argue like centuries, or whatever, or a century or so. But the point is that you've drawn attention to some things that are happening at the border that we don't always pay attention to. Number one, and this is something that, of course, is really shaping the debate in the United States. So could you tell us a little bit more about why you think that's true, and what might what lessons we might draw from that, or how we could take it further?
So we think about the border as this very systematic relationship we've built over many decades, but of course, empirically, it's not entirely true. The United States has had a much longer track record of systematically working at the border. The United States posted health inspectors out in the port of Montreal in the late 19th century, for instance. So this element of pushing the border out is not new. But the systematic relationship with the border really dates back to the 1990s of building sort of a common border regime, initially driven sort of by globalization and by trade, but then also driven by 9/11. And in the aftermath of 9/11, then Jean Chrétien government sending a signal to Washington, understanding that the border and the border relationship is existential for Canada, given the immensity of the trade relationship. And so, yes, I think 38 US states have Canada as their top trading partner, but the importance, the economic importance of the relationship is far more important to Canada and to Canadian provinces than it is to most US states, and arguably existential. And Canada learned that the hard way after 9/11. We recently had a quick laboratory experiment as to what happens when you close parts of the border during the trucker convoy protest in Ottawa, and the closure of the Windsor-Detroit, the momentary closure of the Windsor-Detroit corridor. And so the Canadian government reacted at the time by sending a clear signal to Washington that the Americans might have lots of problems in the world to worry about, but that Canada is not and should not be one of them, and that Canada has America's back. And I wonder, and I'm concerned that perhaps, yes, there's always some rhetoric in, I think, especially Congress when it comes to northern border security, because of course most of these are economically deprived peripheral jurisdictions. And so given the amounts of resources that are being invested in the border by the US administration, those, if you're a good congressman, you want to make sure that some of those resources come into your border jurisdiction. The U.S. is the one federation that does not have a systematic fiscal equalization scheme, so defense and security in some ways substitute in the U.S. for equalization. So we shouldn't be entirely surprised. But I do think given the many different voices that have raised concerns about different aspects of the northern border, and how the northern border is being handled, that I worry that the current government has not only among the many different priorities it has going on, has not paid a systematic attention to the border as any Canadian government would need to, and that has had second and third order unintended consequences about which the U.S. administration and Congress are increasingly worried. And so reestablishing, I think, that confidence and that trust by U.S. administrations that Canada has America's best interests at heart when it comes to the border in terms of balancing both security and trade is a message that I worry is not being heard as clearly as it was after 9/11. And when you compound that with American concerns, as you just pointed out, that certain allies need to do more for the multilateral relationship because the transaction costs of preserving stability in a fragile world are necessarily going up, and so you need to invest more for the same types of geostrategic interests and returns. So that's, of course, particularly the investment in defense. But of course, if you also look, for instance, at recent cuts, the Prime Minister likes to tell the international community that he's investing in defense, and there'll be new investments, I think, in 2032 or so. But in reality, of course, the current government is actively imposing cuts, $1 billion on defense this year. Global Affairs Canada was hit with on a percentage-wise, even larger cuts. So the ability for Canada to invest is atrophying, and I think that is precisely what different voices in the United States are concerned about in the international environment.
Oh yeah, because I mean the number of illegal migrants that are coming into the United States through the northern border has exploded, compared to recent history, and including people on watch list, et cetera, who then and I think any U.S. administration, I would hope, would be very concerned about that. I know that if there's I would imagine even a potential Harris administration would care about that, but it would be looking for ways to, but certainly a Trump administration would. And would really be looking for seriousness on that on that border as well. But you mentioned defense, and that was one thing I really wanted to talk about because this is there was a headline in Newsweek last week entitled "Trudeau, not Trump, is the greatest threat to NATO." And then there was I played a very minor part in a YouTube documentary by Aaron Gunn titled "Forsaken Warriors: How Trudeau Broke Canada's Military," which has, last time I checked, had more than 300,000 views. And I mean, Canada, as you rightly said, was a military, if not superpower, had a very serious military in the first half of the 20th century. And not to mention, I mean, the battles, Vimy Ridge and Normandy, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the list goes on. Your military was really top world class, and it's been allowed to atrophy over the decades, but particularly since I would argue since the Liberals have been in power, and since 2015, which you alluded to, and I mean I know people don't like to talk about this, but I mean your GDP, your defense spending as a percentage of GDP is in the 1.3, 1.4 percentage range, which is really probably among the lowest in NATO. And it makes it just feeds this sort of this perspective that Canada is just not taking this issue seriously. I was at the Halifax Security Forum when in 2015 when Prime Minister Trudeau he said he was not going to buy the F-35, and of course that was a very we don't measure countries by virtue of whether they buy the F-35 or not. But the point is that it's become the standard. Basically the standard aircraft platform, and it does really help with interoperability, and it illustrates a degree of seriousness about capabilities that is wanting in some allies. And I know that there's a very strong voice in Canada to fix this trend, but the Prime Minister has been on record as saying we're not going to get to 2%. And I'm not paraphrasing there, but I mean, and it's or maybe in 10 years. I mean, it's 8. It's just not and this goes over like a lead balloon in Washington. Sort of when the Democrats are in the White House, they don't really make as much of an issue out of this. But when the Republicans are, if there's a Republican outcome in November, this is going to be an issue. And I know you have so many serious military people that the YouTube video, the Air and Gun video, I would commend it to people. It's very, very well done, quoting military officer after, like senior, chief of defense. I mean, very, there's very senior, people who's with profound military experience, very credible, just going on and on about this. And I mean, what are we to make of this? Is this an ideological thing, or because there are so many important and profoundly well informed people in Canada who've been pushing for more, and yet it never seems to happen. What are we to make of this?
My first question would be yes, Aaron Gunn's documentary outlines the state of the circumstances in the military, but it doesn't ask why. And I think it also fails to recognize that despite the state of the military, Canada has continued to commit to missions, including, of course, a significant heavy lift in Latvia. But if you go to the website of National Defence, you can see a nice map of Canadian commitments, and you can see that those commitments are overwhelmingly concentrated along Canada and allies' borders with Russia. So going all the way over from the Arctic through the Nordic countries, down through Central and Eastern Europe, including in Romania, and through the Mediterranean with the standing naval mission in the Mediterranean. And so Canada has, I think it reinforces that perspective that I brought up before about continental defense and the transatlantic relationship. But of course, the critics in Washington rightly point out, Canada has spent 25 years talking about about capabilities and commitments, that it's making commitments and it has the capabilities. And so don't worry about the cash. But of course, what we hear is that people are worrying about the cash because the capabilities aren't there. But I think it's not just a matter of cash. I think it's a question of purpose. I think we've forgotten the purpose of the Canadian Armed Forces, not just among politicians, but I worry sometimes even within the bureaucracy and perhaps even among some members of the uniform. Why is Canada buying kit? Why does Canada need to invest? I think to that extent, we also forget about that defense spending is ultimately an insurance premium. And so Canadian politicians, always sort of masters of the art of the possible, will always try to invest the absolute minimum necessary in order to get the maximum returns for their investment. And I think what the criticism that Canada is receiving suggests that Canadian politicians no longer have that calculation right in terms of the risk assessment. And so I think that has a couple of dimensions with the current government. These are just speculations on my part. One is that the current Prime Minister likes to run a fairly consensus-based cabinet decision-making process, and it's very difficult to get consensus around defense decisions And when money is tight, other opportunities to allocate budgets, in particular when you're a minority government and you're hoping to win the next election. The other is that I think there's also an ideological dimension by some members of cabinet currently that are simply predisposed against the military and military type of ways of doing things, that simply believe that you can somehow assert the liberal international rules-based political order simply by saying that we have convening power, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs says. But of course, if you want to have convening power, you need to have legitimacy. And the example that I often bring here is 1956 in the Suez Crisis. Right? So Canada didn't, so peacekeeping wasn't sort of an invention by Canada to make the world a better place. It was a very deliberate investment by Canada to avoid the superpowers from going to war, let alone from going to nuclear war, because Canada and everyone else was clearly going to lose. And so coming up with this concept to try to assert regional stability. So 1956, Canada in many ways becomes the kingmaker in terms of in terms of breaking the backlog over this very serious crisis. Look at Canada's influence in the Middle East today. And you can ask yourself, how much sway does Canada have in terms of the conflict, in terms of bringing some stability back to the region, irrespective of what views of what people might hold? You might argue that for a middle power such as Canada, it's ultimately about stability. And if you're not investing actively, you don't have those capabilities to assert. And I would say whether that's on foreign affairs or it's on the armed forces. And part of the purpose about the armed forces and the Canadian Armed Forces is also understanding the Canadian Armed Forces as an instrument. My argument is always that for Canada, and I think for the United States as well, the armed forces are an instrument of foreign policy, arguably the most important instrument of foreign policy in terms of what it allows you to do. And the Canadian Armed Forces had long been, if you think of NATO as a six-pack in terms of beer, you can get different varieties of beer in a six-pack, but you don't necessarily like all these varieties the same. And the Americans always really liked the Canadian flavor, because the Canadian flavor came fully interoperational. It came with its own abilities to provide for itself. You didn't need to fly the Canadians there. You didn't need to teach them how to do stuff. They come with their own headquarters capacity. They come with the necessary experience. And so you could always leverage the Canadians. You could especially leverage them in situations where the United States, either for political reasons, would have greater difficulty intervening themselves, or where the United States faces disproportionately high collective action problems, for instance, in linguistic terms, so Canada's involvement in Franc-Afrique and in places like Haiti. And so I think this is my sense where the United States is looking to Canada in terms of Canada is no longer able to provide that value added systematically that the United States has systematically looked to Canada for. And that's, I think, a sense of the purpose as an instrument of foreign policy, but also as an instrument ultimately of being able to contest war and thinking of the military as warfighters. And I think we've somehow lost track of that. So why are we buying all this kit? Why are we building? Why do we have the national shipbuilding strategy and building frigates? Why are we thinking about buying submarines? Why buying F-35s? I think most Canadian politicians aren't really thinking about these as capabilities that you may need ultimately not just for deterrence, but possibly to win. And look, it's going to be much more expensive and much more costly. This is the lesson from the first half of the 20th century. If you have to get into the game to win, then if you invest a little bit more now in a heightened sort of more fragile security environment in order to continue to reassert deterrence. And I think that element of the Canadian Armed Forces as an instrument of deterrence and collective deterrence is perhaps not, I don't want to say entirely lost, but perhaps not as understood strategically as it could be.
I mean, I guess the message is we'd love to see more Canada, because I was in RC South in Afghanistan when Canada was in charge of RC South, And when I was at the embassy in Ottawa, Canada was doing some very, very good things on Haiti. We'd love to see more Canada, but the resources have to be there and the purpose has to be there, and sometimes we don't see that.
Look, I mean, look at what the reason why I think the Prime Minister has a credibility problem in Washington among allies, because they've seen this movie before. The 2017 defense policy, strong, secure, engaged, backloaded the bulk of spending into the last 3 years. And now that we're getting to those last 3 years, what's the government doing? Instead of making good on its commitment to actually invest, because the assumption was, who knows whether we're still going to be in power, so we'll make this a 10-year sort of strategy, we'll backload all the spending. Now the government is still in power, it's realizing that those commitments are actually really expensive. And if you track Canadian white papers sort of over the years and defense policies, this is a perennial problem where governments promise to invest and then ultimately they don't invest. And so when the Prime Minister shows up in Washington and says, yes, we'll invest by 2032, and yes, we may eventually sort of get to 2%, just trust us, we're going to figure it out, they look at what the Prime Minister assured in 2017, and they worry deeply about, if you're not going to follow, if you're not willing to follow through on the commitments now, in a world that arguably is much more dangerous than it was in 2017, can we actually believe what you're telling us now?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I turn on China because I mean, just in the last few weeks, I've seen one article sort of, China could not dream of a better ally than Justin Trudeau. Or, for example, I mean, then there's because Justin Trudeau has had a special relationship with China for a long time. His famous phrase was about his admiration for the basic dictatorship of China was something that I think has haunted him ever since, and reflected the complexity of your relationship with that country, as well as your perhaps some people would argue naivete and unwillingness to recognize it for what it is. In other words, seeing it as a trade relationship only, but also more than that. When in fact there's other very important dimensions to that, which are very concerning, including to the United States. Not so much because, I mean, Canada can have whatever relationship it has with whatever country it wants, of course. I mean, but it's the effect that it has on the United States because how China is using Canada as a platform to expand its influence over the North American continent, which of course affects us because you're perceived by the Chinese as a more friendly, as a country from which to export malign activity into the United States, or use your country as a backdoor into the United States, and that is something that has disturbed people. But could you talk about that now, because you've had a bit of a wake-up call. I mean, and I do hear different voices coming out of Canada that this is in fact maybe not all that we thought that it was thought to be, and wondering how that is changing, because this is of course something that on which both parties have pretty similar views. So regardless of what happens in November, both whoever's in the White House will care about this, and will maybe have some more difficult conversations with Canada than might have been the case 10 years ago or 5 years ago or even now.
So middle powers always try to preserve a sense of sovereignty in their own decision making, right? So it's not entirely surprising that a country such as Canada would have would choose for any number of reasons to have different types of relations with countries with which the U.S. has long had a difficult relationship, China, Cuba, and the like. The Chinese. So I should preface this by saying that I'm not an expert in that particular relationship, but of course, Canada, and in particular some entities in Quebec, including ones that have long-standing, relatively close relationships with some of the folks in power in Ottawa currently, have important investments in China. And that the government has made a decision that I think those investments are ultimately important, whether they're strategically important, economically important, politically important for the government. But I think there's also a sense of that strategically not wanting to get caught in the rivalry between China and the United States and trying to find some middle ground. And I think that middle ground is inherently increasingly difficult increasingly difficult to find. But of course, China is not the only relationship that is problematic. We might have an opportunity to talk about India, but there are other countries that, of course, are in one way or another meddling in Canada's affairs. Iran, Russia to a lesser extent. And Canada is a highly connected country. It's a very diverse society, so it's relatively easy if you want to co-opt certain diaspora and elements of ethno-linguistic, ethno-cultural groups for your purposes. Inherently, Canada's intelligence security posture is less robust than that of the United States, simply in terms of resources. So that makes Canada a target by actors, including actors such as China. The difference, of course, is that in many ways, China, Iran poses a challenge to the regional order, perhaps a little bit of a challenge to the international order, but of course, the Chinese regime is on record as wanting to not just revise that order, but to overturn that order. And so from a middle power perspective, I've personally not quite understood the approach that the current government has taken. I'm on record as one of the people that systematically, and one of the first voices that spoke out, for instance, about the danger that Huawei routers posed. And so the government always seems to be sort of the last one to follow as a middle power. As I point out, you never want to be the first ones out of the starting block, but you probably don't always want to be the last ones. And so it contributes, I think, to this perception, if not reality, in Washington, that Canada is not the reliable, loyal ally that it used to be, and that Canada fails to understand the strategic importance of that relationship, rather than, for instance, just the prosperity that ultimately comes with it. I mean, there are silver linings in that. There's perhaps no democracy in the world where we have more of an open source, open intelligence laboratory on foreign interference and malign influence than we do in Canada, thanks to the Hogue inquiry and into the public debates. And so perhaps if there is a silver lining, it is making apparent what is happening in all other allied and partner democracies. It's just not as apparent. And so perhaps here's an opportunity for Canada at least to try to lead the way in making more transparent what is ultimately happening, and trying to figure out how do we posture ourselves in a more resilient fashion in an environment where arguably, look, why would you attack the continent kinetically when on a daily basis you can attack our political institutions, our prosperity, our social cohesion, and the like, and where Canada, I think, is perceived as not pulling the weight that it needs to in terms of bilateral and multilateral relationship.
Well, I noticed that in connection with the foreign interference issue, that the deputy foreign minister recently described this as, did not believe that China's actions in this constituted foreign interference, but rather a legitimate diplomatic campaign, which sounds to me like a little bit of denial. But I used to work very closely with him in years, and I don't want to criticize him publicly, but I think there's a little bit of, he is a diplomat after all, and has to, but I'm concerned about that kind of approach.
I mean, these are well-known. I mean, the issue with Chinese triads in Canada and those triads being leveraged by Chinese, by the Ministry of State Security goes back to the 1980s. The Pacific strategy in 1997 in terms of free trade that ignored the fact that this would provide ample access for billions of dollars in illicit resources to the North American continent. And I think one of the risks here is that, and we see this in how the Americans, I think, are approaching this, is that if Canada can't get it done, the United States will do it for Canada. And I think if you look at, for instance, the recent TD Bank fine, this is part of the signal about this is what you should be able to do as Canadians and as the government of Canada. You need to provide a regulatory framework that ensures that your financial institutions are not being leveraged by adversarial, hostile actors, state and non-state, to undermine our societies. I would encourage everybody to view, it's up on C-SPAN, Merrick Garland's press conference on this issue. he's very clear in terms of the challenges and why there's a criminal indictment that comes not with this, and the implications this has strategically in terms of not just the penalty, but the ability of TD Bank's ability to raise capital. So this will have very long-term ramifications. And I think here's sort of and look, if you're a Mexican cartel, if you're a Chinese triad, what bank are you going to pick? If you're going to be operating in both countries, you're going to pick a very robust financial institutions that allows you to easily operate and move money between the two countries and that has a global reach. Yep. So TD Bank and other Canadian banks are obvious targets. And I think it is not just about TD Bank. It is about Merrick Garland and the US government sending a clear message to Ottawa. You need to make sure that this does not happen within your banks. And when the largest fines that we levy in Canada, CIBC 1 million, TD Bank and RBC 7 million and 9 million each, I think there's a sense in Washington that perhaps Canada has, the government announced in budget 2019 that it would posture the Money Laundering, Terrorism Financing and Proceeds of Crime Act much more robustly. And we're all still waiting with bated breath.
There's just so much to talk about here, and I'm looking at my watch and I'm thinking, oh no, we're nearing the end. But can I just ask you before we turn it over to our guests, just anything you want to say about the election next year? What Americans should understand about your electoral process, which of course is ongoing, and we have a resurgent Conservative Party doing very, very well in the polls, very unpopular government, but I'd let you characterize that and any takeaways we should have for what, as we watch this election season unfold in your country?
Well, one quick takeaway why all parties in Canada should have a vested interest in preserving the international rules-based order and investing in defense and avoiding a hot war and a hot international conflict is because, of course, the greatest national unity crisis Canada has ever known was as a result of conscription. So the inference to draw is that ultimately war, in particular global conflict, can have very detrimental ramifications for Canadian unity. And I think regardless of who wins the election, Canada is going to be back to a very significant national unity challenges, which ultimately will further undermine, I think, Washington's ability to get Canada to focus on the geostrategic priorities that Washington might have for Canada. And so I think one of the challenges that both Canada and the United States are likely to have in the years coming forward, that they're going to be so embroiled in their own domestic challenges that other partners and allies will not be able to get them to pay the attention and provide the value added internationally that they might want them to provide.
So it'll be a distracting factor, and it'll make it more difficult for Canada to step up and play the role that everyone would like to play.
Even with a majority government, I think that will be the case.
Even with a majority progressive conservative government.
For instance, so irrespective of the outcome of the election.
Yeah. Okay, well, with that, on that note, we have I'm sorry, we only have can we go a little bit over 11 o'clock? Do people mind? All right, I know your time is valuable. So does anybody, thank you again for those very incisive comments. Does anybody have any, yes?